Hey everyone, it's the Knitty Professor, and today I thought I would look into the connections between knitting and fiber crafting and our American Transcendentalist thinkers. And what got me thinking about this topic is I recently read a chapter from the book I was talking to you all about a week or so ago called Faithful Practices, and it was on the idea of being present and the need for being attentive. So again, here's the book, Faithful Practices, and a couple of you said the last time I was talking about this book that you were familiar with it, which I think is awesome. Tells me that it is worth reading. And the chapter that I read is called The Bloom of the Present Moment, and the author is Barry Andrews. So Barry Andrews looks at some transcendentalist thinking and its connection to spiritual practices, and as I was reading about that, I was thinking that there are a lot of connections to knitting, especially knitting as not necessarily the means to an end, but a means unto itself. And obviously this would apply to, I think, really most fiber crafting, especially if it is a kind of a rhythmic, repetitive motion, such as spinning, crocheting, maybe, hand sewing, felting, stitching of any kind, really. So as far as the content of the chapter, there are a lot of really interesting nuggets of thinking in the chapter that Andrews wrote. Spirituality is akin in his mind to waking up and to being aware. So instead of a teleological kind of perspective of, waiting for God and, trying to prepare for death and this kind of thing, spirituality is about right now. It's about the now, about embracing the present moment. And that, in the minds of the Transcendentalists, that was living. So to the extent that spirituality embraces living, and I would argue that there are a lot of spiritual practices that don't, right? They literally embrace dying. My way of thinking of spirituality is embracing living, because as far as I'm concerned, that's what we have. And the problem with trying to do that is the fact that we're anesthetized on an ongoing basis by distraction and routine and the necessity of doing things that bring us money, but they don't bring us joy. This is just a recurring problem. It's the whole rat race theme. We're constantly being asked to do things that they sort of go against living. It's sort of like a living dying kind of thing, with meaningless activities that harm our bodies. And yes, they may bring us money, which can bring us the means to survive, but they don't bring us living. Every moment in the notion of this Andrews is precious and deserving of acknowledgement. And I'm sure that a lot of you can relate to this idea of being present, and that's really what it's all about, that every moment is a gift. Every day offers precious gifts that we should appreciate. So the question is, how can this kind of activity bolster our ability to look at life that way, to acknowledge the gift of the moment, the gift of living in the present? Because only in the present moment, that's what Andrews argues, only in the present moment can happiness and growth occur. You're not going to be happy by wishing or regretting. You can only be happy now. It's a really interesting claim, and I'd be curious how many of you agree with it. We need to make the most of every moment, and the key to doing that is attentiveness, paying attention. We have a tendency to seek distraction, and I think this is, it's like almost ingrained in us that we have to go to our phones and doom scroll, because maybe it's because there's so many ugly things in the world that we have to be distracted. And a part of me wonders if this is a distraction. But in many ways, I think the distraction is all of the titillation and the positing of everything as being extreme. Every raindrop is going to be a flood. Every ray of sunshine is going to result in drought. We're almost conditioned to expect the, quote, news to titillate us, frighten us, and numb us. So I think stitching is a wonderful antidote and probably much more conducive to living in the present than paying attention to the media or engaging in activities that don't bring us joy. Any moment, and this is a direct quote, any moment can be a gateway to the infinite. I think that's a really cool way of thinking. I often wonder, I look up and I'm like, what's out there? Or I look at even tiny things like the leaves on these trees and just the incredible complexity and miracle of life that takes place in a blade of grass. And that's sort of a window on the infinite, Thoreau had the idea that we should be drenched in the reality that surrounds us. So when he was at Walden Pond, just the idea of being drenched, and I like to view this as a kind of opportunity for sensory experience. I'm hearing a plane above right now. I hear the wind in the trees. I heard cicadas a bit ago. My needles are wooden, so they don't really make a clacking sound, but if I really listen attentively, I can probably hear some kind of a light tapping sound on the part of my needles. I might hear a dragonfly going by. I can also smell all the greenery around me. There, I hear a bird. That stopped. Just the very air of summer. It's rather humid here today. The smell of the humidity, I almost thought I was smelling a kind of a mildew, just because I'm sure the soil is rife with all kinds of, processes going on, converting it into fertile ground for the additional trees I hope to add to my yard. So there's just so much surrounding me that I can feel, and I'll get into this in a second, just the very tactile experience of holding wool in my hands. The next section of the article emphasized taking time to slow down and observe, and I think there's room to, again, question whether, crafting is a distraction or not. I'm going to argue that it actually is not, that it's instead a way to kind of center our thoughts and to remove distractions by focusing us on a very simple tactile activity. So we can consider a lot of things, like in this knitting, so this is my sock yarn sweater that I'm knitting up. There's so many things that I could sort of center my attention on in order to gain this sort of attentive spirit. I can focus on the texture in my hands. I can focus on all this color. This is like a riot of color going on with all this different, these sock yarn remnants that I'm putting together in here. I can focus on each stitch as I'm making it. I can focus on each row as I'm making it. I can focus on the fabric that is being created as I knit. I can focus on the feel of the yarn in my hands. Every little motion, like wrapping this yarn around my pinky in order to tension the yarn, and just the very fact that I don't really have to think about what I'm doing, right? It's just amazing to think that the nervous system is sort of telling my hands what to do based on what I would call in educational terms procedural knowledge. I had to learn how to knit through declarative knowledge. I had to have it explained to me, but after a while it becomes an automatic process, and it's just kind of miraculous really that all these actions can take place that I can guide almost unconsciously, and in the process create ultimately a garment that I can wear and then remind me of all this pleasant experience. So I think Thoreau might have argued that knitting was work, but on the other hand, he didn't argue that walking was work. So I would like to argue that knitting can be viewed as an experience. Knitting can be work. If you're fighting to get a test knit up in time, or struggling to get your grandchild's sweater knit before they reach the 18-month size or something, knitting can definitely be work. But in something like this, so this is all just stockinette stitch, right? And that's one of the reasons why I brought this out here to knit on. I think it's very much like walking and contemplating, because again, it sort of takes the onus away from my brain to decide what I should be doing with my hands. I could just be fidgeting, right? And I could just be nervous. But instead, my body's occupied just as it would be by walking in the woods. I'm kind of in the woods here. We grew this what my son likes to call the back ridge by letting all these volunteer trees pop up because nothing we tried to plant there on purpose would grow. And now we have a nice shady spot where I can engage in this contemplative activity. So in answer to the question, can contemplation accompany or be part and parcel of knitting? I would say yes, absolutely. It just depends on what you're knitting. And there's really no shame in eschewing challenge. I think we have every right, we've earned the right to construct our crafting activities as activities that are conduce to meditating, contemplating, by sort of soothing our physical need for activity. And it's like a replacement for fidgeting, but it's one that is also, just happens to be productive. It's like walking can get you somewhere, right? That's a kind of work. Knitting can get you somewhere. It can produce something that you can then, down the road, wear, use, enjoy. So when my hands are occupied, I think my brain can be freed up to contemplate, to think, to be spiritual, and to probably even engage in even greater ends, which I'll take a look at here in a minute. So summing up the latter paragraphs of this article that I read, the author recommends savoring the moment-to-moment unfolding of the present, which I think is an awesome idea, the moment-to-moment unfolding of the present. The present is ongoing. It's not static. So there is an unfolding that if we're going to recognize the beauty and the miracle of the present, we do have to acknowledge that it does unfold. It takes place. It's not just complete static rest. On the other hand, it offers an opportunity for stillness and for what the author calls freedom from worldly engagements. And a lot of times these worldly engagements they're not necessarily pleasant. They're stress-inducing. They make us sad, especially nowadays. And our crafting, our felting, our spinning, our knitting, our crocheting, our stitching are a great way to take us away from these worldly engagements. So after I read this chapter, I took a little closer look at Transcendentalist thought and its connection to knitting, and looking at Thoreau and Emerson. So one of the basic ideas behind transcendental thought was this notion of the art of life, with the goal of detecting traces of the ineffable. And I did a podcast recently on the connections between language and knitting, fiber crafting, weaving, making with fiber. But there are times when language fails us and when we have to listen beyond our rational thinking and our linguistic limitations, and they are limiting. As a writer, there are many times when I'm just frustrated by I can't say what I want to say. And you have to figure out ways around that, metaphors, experiences, just letting the reader guess at what you're trying to get at. But this idea of the ineffable, I think there's room for arguing that by sitting and doing something like this with our hands, making something with a rhythmic, meditative approach, that it gives our souls a kind of a space to engage with this, what the Transcendentalists call the ineffable. Now I hear the cicadas. And I hear a bird I'm not familiar with. I like to use the Merlin app from time to time to figure out what bird I'm actually hearing. It's a little bit far away. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's really cool. But here are some other connections with transcendentalist thinking. So one of the things that Emerson wrote about was self-reliance. So by knitting this sweater with leftover sock yarn, I'm sort of pushing away reliance on industrial production. Yes, the yarn had to probably be industrially produced, although I do have yarn that was not, and I have yarn that I've made myself. But in any case, just by taking this fiber and making my own sweater with it, I am being more self-reliant. I am rebelling against consumer culture because, to be honest, I'm choosing these colors in a very random way. This is not something that you would ever produce in a factory because there's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason to it. You know, I'm just picking the next yarn when I run out and picking one that's sort of mildly compatible. In that way, it goes against, standardization and consumer culture. On the other hand, there's a certain amount of intentionality because I intend to use up yarn that otherwise would go to waste. I intend, with each color that I choose, to at least adhere to some sort of satisfying harmony, as well as whim and a sort of a controlled chaos. So that's another idea of self-reliance, is that creation has intention and it supports my own quest to be myself and to be independent. Another emphasis that was placed by the Transcendentalists was on simplicity and slow production. So allowing the mind to reflect while the hands are engaged, again, as I was arguing, is a lot like walking in the woods. So I can allow my mind to be engaged as I just sit here and let my hands do the walking. My hands are walking, right? That's just the same, I would say, as letting my feet do the walking. And some of us can't walk, right? So this is like the great alternative, is to stitch, to spin, to knit, to craft. Embodied mindfulness comes to mind when we're talking about this tactile activity. The senses are engaged, but in a way that still allows me to be deeply present. And I can't do that if I'm doing what, for example, one of my sons does, which is working in a warehouse where he's always timed and he always has to push and think about what he's doing because it's going to be evaluated. And if he doesn't do it right, he's going to be censured. There's none of that with this. This is just complete relaxation. Another idea in Transcendentalism was the idea of finding the sacred in the everyday. So not looking to, the heavens to find the sacred. The sacred is here and now. The humble task of knitting allows me to encounter the real sacred with this emphasis on rhythmic meditation and caring through creating, and also the pursuit of intuition. Once you get good enough at a craft, you can just use your intuition to guide what you do. Nowadays, all I have to figure out is how many stitches, if I do a little swatch, how many stitches do I need to start a sweater or to start a hat or to start a sock. From there, the rest, I know enough about knitting, just like I do about walking, to just let my instincts guide me and to use my intuition and sort of the power of my own God-given mind to guide what I do so that the final outcome is pleasing, useful, and rewarding. So another thing that the Transcendentalists really emphasized was the connection to nature and the materials of nature. And oftentimes we're creating with things that are from nature, especially if it's, wool, alpaca, carefully raised, cotton, linen, silk. And, it's important to be mindful of how the fiber came into being that we are using. But it's really not hard to find fiber that connects us to nature. And I would not necessarily argue that this is the best choice, because this is sock yarn, which is only 75% superwash wool and 25% nylon. So it's probably not the best illustration. But when I create with yak, for example, or organically raised wool or rare breed wool, or when I spin, BFL that my friend raised, or this kind of thing, I do feel close to nature. And I do feel like I can have a kind of a tactile, sort of grounded relationship with the natural just by intimately getting to know that fiber, especially when I'm spinning, which I should do more of, and comparing and contrasting, for example, spinning camel versus alpaca versus different kinds of wool and how the fiber behaves. It's like getting direct instruction in the ways of nature. And then with the way that the fiber behaves once it's spun into yarn and you knit it up and then you wear it, for example, and you can wear natural fibers on your body and experience how it allows your body to do the things that you want your body to do. So intimacy with the material world and attention to the process of making and the process of dwelling, of just being with your craft and with what you're making, with your ideas, and with the hands that went into creating the fiber that you're using. So another notion that is important with the Transcendentalists is individual expression and resistance to conformity, resistance to standardization, resistance to, I would argue, branding. And the very word brand, just when I think about branding, it angers me because I think about, getting something burned onto your skin so that you belong then to whatever entity, power that is trying to dominate you. And it always it sort of amazes me that people buy into this notion that you have to be branded and all of this swag and stuff. And even when our university was trying to intimate that we should go to the bookstore and buy the branded clothing, which by the way was made with polyester and terrible fabrics, I was just like, no, that's not why I work in this arena. If I wanted to be branded, I would, work at a grocery store or a fast food place and be, allow myself to be portrayed as their slave. And God forbid I should, buy clothing where you just have the words, of the company brandished across the front and you're just a walking advertisement. I always told my kids as we were growing up, I want them to pay me. I want them to pay you. If you're going to wear something that has Gap written all over it, they should pay you. You shouldn't have to pay them, right? So I do really like this idea that the Transcendentalists had of eschewing standardization, of reclaiming our individual identity, our community identity, apart from corporate branding and especially labor-controlled branding. I could go on and on. So in any case, individual expression. And another interesting thought that I ran across when I was looking into the Transcendentalists is the idea of organic time. And I think this is just so cool to think about. Instead of, I have no idea what time it is. I mean, I could look it up, right? I have a phone right in front of me. But am I going to? No, because this afternoon is mine. And I instead can measure time by numbers of stitches. And when I'm knitting, a lot of times I'll measure time by completing a row. Oh, I've completed a row. That's like a measure of time. It's a measure of accomplishment. It's a measure of living. It's a measure of making. Or even maybe, how many stitches I made. Or maybe achieving a little pattern. Maybe it's an 8-stitch repeat and I measure time in 8-stitch repeats when I'm knitting. Or I measure time in, I got something cast on. Or when I'm using DPNs and I have 3 or 4 of them going across, I measure it by like a quadrant. I did the 15 stitches on that row for my sock. And I think that's a really cool way of sort of finding a relationship between the Transcendentalists and their thinking and crafting and knitting, because you can measure time organically by what you're doing and by just the very process of making and living through making. And then the last thought that I ran across, I'll share with you, is the importance of inner dialogue. That if you have this luxury, which often it is a luxury, right, of enjoying solitude while knitting or spinning or crafting, that you can experience what they call transcendental interiority. And I think it's a great way to look into how you can use your crafting as a window onto your soul and an opportunity for cultivating self-knowledge. So I think that's sort of the final thought that I have for you today, but I'd be really curious, especially maybe you're more expert than I am on Transcendentalist thought. Feel free to chime in to add or subtract your observations regarding the connections between knitting and fiber crafting with Transcendentalist thinking. And let me know what your experiences are, like when you're doing what I'm doing, maybe knitting outdoors, which is sometimes tricky in the summer. It's a little bit easier in the spring or the fall. What kinds of birds, what kinds of insects do you hear? What sounds are in your soundscape? What smells do you have? Like bees? Do you have hummingbirds? Trees rustling in the wind? Maybe you're under a roof and you have the sound of raindrops, which is really awesome. On the rare occasion when I get to hear like thunder in the background, that's just so cool. So yeah, I'm gonna enjoy sitting out here. I might get out my Merlin app and try to identify more of the birds that I'm hearing, because I frankly don't recognize them all. I recognize robins and mourning doves and grackles, but some of the other ones I don't necessarily know what they are. So I hope y'all have a wonderful weekend. Thanks for spending some time with me, and I look forward to doing this again. Take care.